This is Brian Tobin. He might just be one of the most important Canadian politicians of the 1990s that you've never heard of. In 1984, Brian Mulroney had just become Prime Minister, and the Liberal Party of Canada suffered their biggest electoral loss in history. Tobin was a Liberal MP throughout the late 80s during Mulroney's tenure, watching from the bench as the Atlantic cod fishery slowly collapsed in his home province of Newfoundland.
What has the minister done since December of 1990 to halt this crisis and decline in cod stocks? What is he doing now to rebuild those cod stocks and to assist the fishing families who are severely affected by this crisis? Yes, a crisis in the cod fishery. Hear, hear.
In 1993, Jean Chrétien led the Liberal Party to victory, ending Brian Mulroney's 9-year reign. As part of the change of government, Brian Tobin found himself promoted to one of the most difficult positions in Canadian politics at the time. He was about to become Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, a year after the Northwest Atlantic cod moratorium had begun. When push came to shove, he was willing to send Canada to the brink of war with a close ally to save what little was left of the fishery on the Grand Banks. By the end of the so-called Turbot War, Tobin had earned himself the nickname of Captain Canada. And if he was Captain Canada, then this was his Civil War. Let's start with some context about the situation around the Grand Banks in the 1970s and 80s. In 1977, Canada, the US, and several other countries claimed an extension to their coastal borders from 12 to 200 miles. This newly extended area is known as an Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. Outside of Canada's border, ocean resources were managed by the North Atlantic Fisheries Organization, also known as NAFO. NAFO is an international organization that aims to provide scientific advice and collaboratively manage international fishery resources in the Northwest Atlantic. Inside of Canada's border, the fishery is managed by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, or the DFO. The problem for Canada was that in 1977, their new 200-mile border was just shy of encompassing all of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. The nose and tail of the banks, as well as the Flemish Cap, are some of the richest fishing grounds in the world. But Canada had been unsuccessful in arguing for those areas to be included in their exclusive economic zone. So, they stayed designated as international waters, meaning that they fell under NAFO jurisdiction. One of NAFO's most important activities is the annual process of setting fishing quotas in their management zone. Countries who join NAFO are expected to follow NAFO guidelines and decisions, and in return, those countries get a say in how things are run. But when problems come up, the organization has very little power to force countries to comply with NAFO decisions. If a NAFO member decides that a fishing quota set by NAFO doesn't align with their own objectives, they could simply object to NAFO's proposal, and they would no longer be bound to any rules that they put in place. When it came to setting fish quotas on international waters, NAFO looked good on paper, but they had no bite. As early as the late 80s, European countries were objecting to most NAFO quotas. This led to most European countries just flat out ignoring NAFO and setting their own, much larger quotas. On top of this, they found several other ways of skirting NAFO scrutiny on the high seas. Often, fish were transferred between ships or landed in non-NAFO member ports to cover up evidence of catches. In some cases, ships would dump entire catches back into the ocean rather than get caught with too much fish or the wrong kinds of fish. In case you were wondering, this wasn't a catch and release procedure, by the way. The fish they were dumping back in the ocean were very much dead. This was done to avoid getting caught breaking NAFO rules, but even then it was more about optics than actual consequences. Under international law, infractions of NAFO regulations could only be prosecuted by the country the boat was registered in. So, if a ship's home country didn't care, skirting NAFO rules in this way was just the cost of doing business. And business was booming. That is, until 1992. The collapse of the Northwest Atlantic cod fishery was a huge rug pull for NAFO members. Overfishing had driven the cod into near extinction, and Canada and the European Union were both hit hard. Tens of thousands of jobs were lost, not to mention the cultural impact to areas like Newfoundland, where fishing cod was ingrained in the province's identity. Without this crucial stock, Canada and others were scrambling for protein sources that could fill the hole left by the lack of cod. That's where turbot comes in. Greenland turbot, otherwise known as Greenland halibut, is a bottom-dwelling fish that has evolved such that both of its eyes are on the right side of its head. Let's be honest, this is a pretty ugly fish. But when the cod had all but vanished, suddenly the turbot that previously no one was very interested in was all they could settle for. And oh boy, they settled fast. By 1994, Canadian researchers had determined that turbot was being fished so aggressively that the total biomass of the species had dropped by almost 70% in just 3 years. On top of that, the population had way more young fish than mature ones, which was really bad news since turbot don't reach breeding age until they're 10 years old. Just 2 years after the Northwest Atlantic cod population had collapsed, the world was on the verge of adding another species of fish to the chopping block. Part of the problem was that as of 1994, turbot was one of the few commercially viable fish that NAFO didn't set a total allowable catch, or TAC, for. This was mostly because until the cod collapse, it wasn't being fished in large enough quantities to be a concern. But Canada, particularly Newfoundland, was still very much reeling from the cod moratorium. Although many fishermen had turned to turbot after 1992 as a way to cope, people generally understood what was at stake with the turbot if nothing was learned from the cod collapse. In June of 1994, Canada requested that NAFO set a turbot quota for the first time in the organization's history. As Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, Brian Tobin preemptively slashed the DFO's domestic turbot quotas by 75% as a show of good faith towards NAFO. Tobin wanted to show just how serious he was about protecting the Northwest Atlantic ecosystem and the long-term viability of its fisheries. On the advice of their scientists, NAFO came to an agreement to set a TAC of 27,000 tons for turbot in 1995. The hard part was figuring out how to divide it up between the NAFO members. This allocation was to be decided by a vote at a NAFO meeting in Brussels on February 1st, 1995. For the past 3 years, the 15 member countries of the EU had taken a combined 50,000 tons of turbot per year. No matter what, they were looking at some serious job cuts to their fisheries with this new turbot quota. At the meeting in Brussels, the EU argued that based on these historical catch rates, they should get the lion's share of the quota. But while Canada had been arguing for conservation, they weren't going to take a reduction in their own quotas lying down. Brian Tobin wasn't part of the Canadian NAFO delegation and therefore wasn't allowed in the meeting where the turbot quota was allocated. But he was still the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, and he was well versed in the art of the deal. Leading up to the conference in Brussels, Tobin was negotiating with other NAFO members to secure their support of Canada's allocation proposal to NAFO. Poland was offered a small contract to fish silver hake from Canada's west coast in exchange for their support. The Japanese could be counted on because of the existing tuna quotas in Canada that were extremely valuable for them. South Korea was warned that their economic relationship with Canada as a whole was on the line, so if they couldn't vote with Canada, then they had better abstain. Some might call these backroom deals a form of bribery and extortion. Others might just call it politics. Regardless, Tobin was able to make several deals that gave Canada the allies it needed in the allocation vote. Once the votes were tallied, Canada's proposal was narrowly accepted 6-5 with 2 abstentions. Canada had been awarded 60% of the 27,000-ton TAC, while the EU, with its 15 member countries, was given just 13%. This was the first time in NAFO history where NAFO members had failed to reach a unanimous consensus on their annual fishing plan. The allocation vote obviously upset the EU, but particularly enraged were Spain and Portugal. On the ocean, Spain and Portugal were known as the bad boys, due to their proclivity to bending and breaking any NAFO rule that got in the way of them catching as much fish as they could. Spain's long-distance fishing fleet was 10,000 boats strong, more than the other 14 members of the European Union combined. Their long-distance fishing boats had been fishing the Grand Banks for the past 500 years, just like Newfoundland, and in their minds, they had every right to be there. So the Spanish decided that they were going to continue to catch their fill, NAFO rules be damned. A Spanish negotiator at the NAFO delegation in Brussels told one of the Canadian negotiators, "You are not going to kick us off the nose and tail of the banks." The thing is, they had no idea just how far Brian Tobin would go to do just that. What Spain had perhaps not appreciated was the situation in Newfoundland. Brian Tobin was under immense pressure in his home province to do something about the most egregious overfishing abusers on the Grand Banks. His constituents in Newfoundland were being told by their federal government that after nearly 500 years, they were no longer allowed to fish cod because overfishing had caused their population to collapse. At the same time, in their own backyard, foreign boats were stealing whatever they could get their nets on from other endangered populations like turbot. Newfoundlanders were demanding that the federal government do something. Not later, not when it was convenient, but now. Tobin was quick to echo his constituents' concerns. At a fishing conference in Newfoundland in mid-February, Tobin made it clear that Ottawa would protect the country against reckless EU policies. As Tobin claimed, it was the EU use of the NAFO objection procedure in the late 1980s that led to the moratoria on flatfish and cod on the tail of the Grand Banks. Now, this wasn't strictly true. The EU had used the objection procedure to set arbitrarily large cod quotas for themselves, but within Canada's borders, the Canadian government also failed to reduce their own quotas in time to save the cod. Regardless of the truth in Tobin's statement, it was what the people wanted to hear. Their MP was willing to go to bat for them, and he would swing as hard as he needed to. As February came to an end, tensions were coming to a head between the EU and Canada. On March 1st, the EU formally introduced an objection to the NAFO Turbot TAC and unilaterally set their own quota, equal to what Canada had been awarded. This wasn't going to fly for Brian Tobin. In response, he dispatched extra patrol ships, helicopters, and submarines to track foreign boats just outside of the Canadian exclusion zone. He also made it clear that Canada was ready to board foreign ships if they were suspected of violating NAFO regulations or quotas. In other words, Canada was threatening to board and seize any EU fishing boat trying to fish the Grand Banks, even if they were outside of Canada's border. But Canada wasn't really looking for a fight. On March 3rd, Ottawa formally requested a 60-day pause from the EU on turbot fishing so they could work together to resolve the issue diplomatically. The EU wanted time to consider the Canadian request, but Canada saw this as a stall tactic to keep European boats fishing on the Grand Banks. This is when Canada threw the first real diplomatic punch. That evening, Canadian officials notified the EU that an amendment to Canada's Coastal Fisheries Protection Act had just been approved. The new amendment declared it illegal specifically for Spain and Portugal to fish stocks that straddled the boundary of the exclusive economic zone. Technically, Canada didn't have the jurisdiction to make this amendment. NAFO were the ones in charge of regulating fishing outside of the exclusive economic zone. But Canada went ahead with the amendment anyway. Someone had to put a stop to the Spanish and Portuguese, and apparently it was gonna have to be Canada. In this drawn-out Captain America Civil War analogy I've been painting, if Brian Tobin is Captain Canada, then standing opposite him would be Emma Bonino as Iron Woman. In 1995, the Italian politician was the Fisheries Commissioner for the EU. Although she had been in the position for less than 3 months, Bonino had nearly 20 years of experience as an elected official, including in foreign policy, working in the European Parliament and the UN. She was quick to defend European interests on the Grand Banks. In response to Canada's "get out or it's gonna get ugly" ultimatum, Emma Bonino let Canadian officials know that the EU would not be backing down. Bonino didn't want a confrontation with Canada, but the EU was prepared to take action if Canada got in the way of Europeans fishing on international waters. On Monday, March 6th, Brian Tobin publicly announced the change made to the Coastal Fisheries Protection Act and warned that any pirate ships fishing off the coast of the Grand Banks would be seized by Canadian authorities. To the surprise of many, the very next day, both the Spanish and Portuguese fleets did stop fishing. Whether it was thanks to the diplomatic talks that were taking place or the poor weather that day is impossible to say. But unable to find common ground, the Spanish and Portuguese fleets resumed fishing on March 9th. Canada and the EU were at an impasse, and the EU was calling Canada's bluff. If Canada acted on their threats, relationships with some of their closest allies in the European Union would take some real damage. The EU figured there was no way they were willing to put their economic, political, and strategic relationships on the line over the small matter of turbot. But Brian Tobin was not bluffing, and he was ready to make an example. Tobin gave the order to the DFO to select and seize a ship in violation of Canada's newly minted maritime law. That day, the crosshairs just so happened to fall on the Esti, an unarmed Spanish fishing boat. The Esti was spotted fishing just outside of Canada's 200-mile zone by a patrol aircraft. 2 armed DFO patrol boats and 1 Canadian Coast Guard ship were dispatched to intercept. 2 attempts were made by the RCMP to board the Esti, but the Esti's crew were somehow able to fend them off and sped off into open waters. To lighten the load and help themselves escape, the Spanish captain ordered his men to cut the Esti's $80,000 nets loose and toss them overboard. But it didn't do much. After 4 hours of pursuit, Canada finally put an end to the cat and mouse game. One of the DFO patrol boats fired 3 machine gun burst warnings across the bow of the Spanish ship. The Spanish captain finally conceded, stopped the boat, and allowed the DFO officers to board their ship. The Spanish were not happy about this. In an emergency meeting in Brussels the day after the capture of the Esti, all 15 member nations of the EU voted unanimously to denounce Tobin's lawless overreach. They warned that there would be serious, long-lasting damage to the EU's relationship with Canada unless the issue was immediately addressed. Spain also took practical action beyond their denouncement. They dispatched their warship Vigia to the Grand Banks to protect their remaining fishing boats in case Canada tried another confiscation on international waters. Spain informed the Canadian Department of National Defence that they would fire on any Canadian vessel attempting to stop them from fishing on the nose and tail of the Grand Banks. Canada had fired the first shots, and now Spain was prepared to fire back. Let's take a step back for a second. On the surface, it may seem like Canada's response to Europe in this entire situation came quite heavy-handed, but there was more at stake in this confrontation than just Canada's Atlantic fishery. As it often happens in politics, this was part of a bigger political move for Chrétien's government. While Tobin was fronting an international offensive on the ocean, Jean Chrétien was fighting a larger domestic battle back home with his home province of Quebec. The early 90s was a time of very strong separatist sentiment within Quebec. In 1990, the federal Bloc Québécois party was formed, whose main goal was to hold a referendum on Quebec's sovereignty and secession from Canada. While Chrétien's Liberals won a majority government in the federal election of 1993, the Bloc Québécois dominated in Quebec, winning 72% of seats in the province and the second most seats in the country, even though they only ran candidates in one province and this was their first federal election as a party. This was the first time ever that a party committed to secession from the rest of the country had become the official opposition party, a problem which Chrétien's government would have to handle. In 1994, Quebec's provincial election also saw the separatist Parti Québécois form government, which set the stage for a referendum on Quebec independence to take place in the fall of 1995. The federal government obviously didn't want a national breakup and needed to find ways to convince Quebec's voters to stay with Canada. The Turbot War provided the perfect show of nationalism to do just that. Polls showed that 90% of Canadians and 84% of Quebecers approved of Tobin's decision to capture the Esti. Days after the ship's capture, Brian Tobin received a standing ovation in the House of Commons, including from members of the Bloc Québécois. At the time, the Bloc had not yet realized that the capture of the Esti was in part a strategy to promote national unity and undermine their case for separatism, and the Bloc even publicly endorsed Brian Tobin's actions. The referendum for Quebec independence was narrowly defeated in the fall of 1995, with just 50.6% voting to stay and 49.4% voting to leave. No doubt that Tobin's strong show of Canadian nationalism played a role in keeping Quebec as part of Canada today. Now, it may seem a bit strange just how much power and influence a single minister could have, particularly one in charge of managing fisheries. But Brian Tobin was an expert at leveraging his position via public opinion in a way that made it extremely difficult for the Prime Minister to oppose him. Tobin was undeniably liked by the Canadian public, and had the moral high ground when it came to overfishing on the Grand Banks by Spain and Portugal. Chrétien wasn't too bothered by Tobin's influence though, and even seemed to find quite the humor in his situation. During the Turbot War, Chrétien once told one of Tobin's aides, "Your Brian thinks he is Napoleon." The Spanish had a different name for Brian Tobin. After the capture of the Esti, they were now calling him El Bandido, and all the port towns in Spain. But back home, Captain Canada was the pride of the country as well as Newfoundland. When the Esti was finally brought into St. John's on March 12th, thousands of people were there waving provincial flags and watching as the crew of the Esti were briskly escorted to the courthouse. The captain and crew of the Esti were charged with violation of the newly amended Coastal Fisheries Protection Act. They posted the $8,000 bail and were released. The Esti itself was released on March 15th after its owners paid the $500,000 bond, and the boat left to return back to Spain that evening. The example had been made, and a search of the Esti had confirmed everything Canada needed to know.
Mr. Speaker, we've commenced inspection, as the Leader of the Opposition has asked, aboard this vessel. I can tell him, based on the preliminary, not the completed and full inspection, but preliminary estimates, that more than 70% of all of the stock found aboard this vessel is very small, sexually immature fish, not capable of reproduction. Mr. Speaker, a good chunk of the fish is smaller than that pen.
Just for reference, an adult turbot is usually about 3 feet long. For 70% of a catch to be small, sexually immature fish means very clearly you are doing damage to the future health of that stock. It's basic biology. Spain was quick to point out that, technically, according to NAFO regulations, there is no minimum size requirement for caught turbot. There were 2 problems with this argument. The first is that it makes you sound, as the Spanish would say, como un pendejo. There's no law that says you can't leave your shopping cart upside down in the middle of a parking lot, but no one's gonna think you're in the right if you do. The second issue is that catching that many small fish brings up the question of how small the mesh in your net must have been, which is a NAFO-regulated specification. The problem is, the Esti had cut their nets when they were trying to escape the DFO, and the net was lost at sea. But it was not lost for long.
And I can also report, I know the Leader of the Opposition will be happy to hear, that Canadian technology and global positioning systems, I'm advertising now to the planet, were successful in their implementation in allowing us to find and to retrieve today the net from the Esti. The net had a 115 millimeter net, which is smaller than the 130 millimeter required by NAFO. But in addition, the net in question had a liner, an 80 millimeter liner in the net.
The mesh net from the Esti measured 115 millimeters, 15 millimeters below the minimum mesh size allowed by NAFO. In addition, the net had a liner with a mesh size of 80 millimeters. Liners are explicitly forbidden by NAFO, and the fact that the Spanish were using this net didn't play well for them trying to shed the image of high sea pirates. The Spanish had broken the rules on how much you can fish, where you can fish, and now even what gear you can use to fish. It seemed like there was no rule they wouldn't break. Through a weird coincidence, Canada and the EU were going to get a chance to air out their grievances on the Turbot War in person on the same stage. It just so happened that a UN conference on fishing was scheduled in New York City at the end of March. On Sunday, March 26th, the day before the conference was set to begin, Canadian officers attempted to board the Verdel, another Spanish ship fishing turbot on the nose of the Grand Banks. The Verdel took off and the Vigia was called in to assist. No shots were fired during the 45-minute pursuit, which ended when heavy fog made it too dangerous for Canada to follow. This chase did prompt the Spanish to pull their remaining 20 or so fishing boats off the Grand Banks that day, to the delight of Brian Tobin. Quote, "Sunday for the Spanish fishing fleet, given that they're no longer fishing, is a day of rest versus a day of arrest, and I'm sure they prefer the rest." The tone for the conference had been set by this second chase on the Grand Banks. On Monday came speeches from both Brian Tobin and Emma Bonino. Tobin's speech framed his position as he had been this whole confrontation. This was an issue of conservation that the Europeans were not taking seriously. Canada was stepping up to do what was right and what was needed. Bonino's speech focused on Canada's flagrant disregard for the laws of the sea with their seizure and boarding of foreign ships, an argument which was undisputable. She also had doubts about Tobin's claims relating to the Estes net. The Estes had been sent home to Spain before the cut net arrived in St. John's, and European officials had yet to see it. So why should they believe Canada's word about what they had found? Quote, "Where is the net? No one has seen the net." To Bonino's surprise, Tobin had brought a little something with him to New York. After her speech, Brian Tobin led the press to a barge on the East River, right across from the UN's building in New York. Hanging from a crane on the barge was the Estes 3-ton severed net. It had taken 3 days to haul it from St. John's all the way to New York, but it was worth the effort for the impact it produced. In front of news cameras, Tobin had the mesh size measured live on air, proving the Estes had been using an illegal liner as well as a non-regulation mesh. There was no more wiggle room for Spain in the eyes of the public. They were in the wrong. Tobin had just capped off his visit to New York with a political mic drop. As Tobin and Bonino finished duking it out at the UN, in Spain the sentiment towards Canada was getting even worse. On April 1st, Spain followed through on an earlier threat and put in place a new policy requiring visas for Canadian citizens entering the country. Later that week, a protest of 3,000 Spanish fishermen at the Canadian Embassy in Madrid ended with the embassy building plastered in rotten eggs and dead fish. The Spanish fishing company who owned the Estes warned that unless Spain got an annual turbot allocation of more than 18,000 tons per year, then almost 10,000 workers would be laid off as a result. The Spanish were going through the same economic spiral that Newfoundland had gone through 3 years prior with the collapse of the cod stocks. But Spain was putting all the blame on Canada. Polls showed that 92% of Spaniards thought that Canadians were the villains in the Turbot War. And of course, in Canada, almost the same proportion of people thought that Canada was doing the right thing. The thing is, Spain wasn't just posturing. Canada had messed up badly and definitely deserved blame for the situation they were in. Since 1977, Canada's territorial claim to the ocean extended 200 miles from the coast. Sure, the nose and tail of the Grand Banks were being overfished by foreign countries, but so was the 90% of it that was squarely under Canadian jurisdiction. The DFO and the federal government knew how bad things had gotten since the mid-1980s, but rather than take drastic conservatory measures, they kept on as they were to protect jobs, just like Spain was doing now. Neither Spain nor Canada was blameless for the state of the ocean in 1995. On April 5th, Canadian patrol boats unsuccessfully attempted to board and cut the net of another Spanish trawler. It was becoming more and more clear that a diplomatic resolution was required to avoid escalation. Although neither side would publicly admit it, by April they were both willing to make some concessions to end the conflict. Spain was seriously considering agreeing to adopt some conservation policies, as well as agreeing to allow third-party observers aboard fishing ships to monitor catches and report on any rule breaking. Canada was willing to give the EU an increased share of the turbot quota NAFO had awarded them. What kept holding up the talks was that no one could agree on what the split of the turbot quota would be. Spain agreed the overall quota had to be reduced, but wanted the lion's share of what was left. On April 15th, a settlement was finally reached between Canada, Spain, and the EU. For Canada, the big victory was getting Spain to agree to allowing independent observers aboard their fishing vessels, as well as consenting to greater rights for Canadian inspection of EU boats on international waters when violations of NAFO rules were suspected. For Spain, they got an increased turbot quota, just like they wanted from the start. Canada gave up 6,000 tons of quota for 1995, putting the EU squarely at 10,000 tons. Spain also wanted the amendment to the Coastal Fisheries Protection Act repealed as a condition to their agreement. Tobin was strongly against this. With a clever legalese maneuver, instead he just took Spain and Portugal off the list of countries covered by the amendment, which would be an extremely easy thing to undo if Canada ever needed to again. Finally, all the charges against the Esti's owners were dropped, their cargo was returned, and Canada paid back the $500,000 bond for the Esti and the $8,000 bail for her crew. The Turbot War had finally come to an end without a single casualty. Or should I say, without any human casualties. Neither side was particularly happy about the concessions made to reach a peaceful agreement. In Newfoundland, the loss of turbot quota meant more strain on an already decimated economy, but it was Spain who got the worst of it. After Canada stood up to Spain's aggressive overfishing practices, several other countries were inspired to do the same. In April, Britain arrested and seized a Spanish trawler illegally fishing off their coast. In May, Morocco demanded huge cuts to the Spanish fishing quotas in their waters. All of a sudden, everyone was pushing back against Spain's fishing practices and pointing to Canada's success in the Turbot War as the precedent for change. Somehow, Brian Tobin had stared down the barrel of an international crisis and came out the victor. When Newfoundland's Premier Clyde Wells retired in 1996, Tobin threw his hat in the ring and easily won the job. Newfoundland's shining star had spent 16 years in Ottawa and had finally decided to return home to the island. But Brian Tobin was not quite finished with Ottawa. He abruptly departed his position as Premier in 2000 when a federal election allowed him to return to Ottawa as an MP. The sudden nature of this departure was odd, but the reason quickly became clear. As it turns out, Jean Chrétien was getting ready for retirement and was looking for an heir to the Liberal throne. Rumor was that Tobin was high on Chrétien's shortlist to replace him when the time came. Unfortunately for Tobin, two forces were working against him. First off, for a guy like Tobin, the job of Prime Minister was basically cursed. Interestingly enough, no Canadian Prime Minister has ever first been a Premier of a province or territory, a streak that still holds today. Secondly, in the early 2000s, the internal workings of the Liberal Party had slowly been slipping out from Chrétien's grip and into the hands of his Minister of Finance. You might have heard of him, a guy by the name of Paul Martin. It became clear that Martin was likely to succeed in replacing Chrétien thanks to this stranglehold on the party. And so, after 22 years as a public servant, Tobin packed his bags and not only left Ottawa, but left politics for good.
No, I don't think I will.